Yeah, thank you very much for the introduction. Thank you so much for having me again. It's great to be with old and hopefully new friends and interlocutors and most of all artists. So my talk has two sections. In the first section, I will criticize a certain conceptual contrast that I think informs naturalism. So I will tell you what I think naturalism is roughly. Kind of, nobody really knows what that is. That's one of the interesting features of naturalism. But I will try to pin it down conceptually to a certain extent, and I will argue that the concept that originates from an attempt of making sense of a very simple contrast. And my example of this contrast will be the contrast between specks and stars. So part one could just be called on specks and stars. And the second part then tries to make sense of a Schellingian idea, given that there are so many Schellingians, also given that we're in an art museum, and Schelling is still, I think, one of the most interesting figures in the history of what at the time was called the philosophy of art and not aesthetics. Given that I feel surrounded by Schellingians, at least I see at least 10 or something like that. That's a lot of them. Most of them are here. And given that we are, entre nous, I will try to make sense of a Schellingian distinction between transcendence, which is what Schelling rejects, and now precisely not immanence, but thinking on this side of a distinction. So in the first part, I will present a certain contrast, and I will undermine that contrast with Schelling's idea that philosophy is really about things that happen on this side of a distinction, not beyond a distinction. And that will be the crucial difference, because Schelling thinks that what is now called naturalism, and which already at this time was called naturalism, that naturalism thinks of nature as if it were another object, or the totality of objects, or whatever. So let's come to naturalism. What's going on there? So let's say that roughly naturalism is the idea that, that's kind of the official definition. Naturalism is the idea that nature is coextensive with whatever the natural sciences tell us nature is. So nature is electrons and up quarks and chemical reactions and neurons and whatever else the natural sciences tells us what there is. So that's roughly what people understand by naturalism, which is why it's also sometimes called scientism and sometimes called physicalism, if you think that physics is something like the science of nature, or whatever else is your candidate. So the fantasy is that nature is that domain under investigation by our best futuristic scientific theorizing. Of course, we haven't arrived there yet. No one knows how to unify physics, let alone what the relation is between all these manifold natural science. But somehow people think that they will be unified, ought to be unified. No one usually gives an argument for that. And the ultimate argument is, of course, economical. It's a bunch of natural scientists bullying around humanities professors at universities in order to get more jobs for their friends, and we are trying to do the same thing with less success. It's called university or science. I think that's what science ultimately is, which is why I will oppose science with truth. I hate science, but I love truth, so this is where I'm going. Okay, so that's roughly naturalism, roughly. As I said, no one really knows what it is. Usually it just means denial of the supernatural. Okay, so if you read standard philosophy textbooks about what naturalism is, people say, well, naturalism means that you certainly do not believe, and then often you get a list in deities and spirits and auras. That's the list suggested by David Lewis at the beginning of one of the worst philosophy books ever written, a book by the title On the Plurality of Worlds. And there's a wonderful destruction of almost every proposition in that book, which is coming out in the summer, a book by Peter Anger by the title Empty Ideas, A Critique of Analytical Philosophy. It's a line-by-line destruction of David Lewis and Saul Kripke, which leads me to Saul Kripke, Specks and Stars. So here's what I think the relevant conceptual contrast is that underlies, okay, the conceptual force that motivates you, or rather bullies you, into believing that you ought to be a naturalist, as long as you want to be an autonomous rational agent. So the option seems to be either you're a religious nutcase or you're a naturalist, okay, which is somewhat of a description of American society. So this is roughly the spectrum. It's still quite different in Europe, but it's a widespread distinction. So here's what I think underlies the idea. I look at the stars at night, but they look kind of small. They're specks. So there's this black, dark background, depending on where I am. Of course, if I'm in the city, there's nothing I can see. But, imagine I'm, somewhere in the countryside, within nature, so that I can also see nature, because now I'm in nature. And it turns out there's this, like this black background, and then all those little specks. But the problem with the specks is, that someone might tell you, well, look, this is a star, and this is a galaxy. And also where you think there's just, pitch darkness, there are really, like billions of galaxies. And then it's like, oh yeah, that's interesting, modern science, look what we all know, it's wonderful epoch. But here's a problem, like I can cover up these specks with my finger, right? So imagine you show me one of those specks, and now I cover up the speck with my finger. Am I covering up a star with my finger? So I do think that you want to say, no, I'm not covering up a star with my finger. Who can do that? I cannot cover up a star with my finger. I can cover up a speck with my finger. And now you need a story, okay, which explains to you the difference between covering up a star with your finger and covering up a speck with your finger. And I think that very distinction drives people motivates people or bullies people into believing that they ought to be naturalists, okay? Why? Because, as we all know, no one can cover up stars with their fingers, but we can cover up specks with our fingers. Therefore, specks are appearances, illusions, etc. So you have to do something about the specks. You have to explain them away. They don't fit into your picture. Okay? They can't be natural. Something's wrong here. Okay? That very distinction. Also, I can cover up the moon. Can I cover up the moon with my hand? No, I can't. But now let's look a little bit closer. What just happened? I think what just happened is something like this. Now imagine you move closer to the moon, much, much closer, and you discover that you can indeed not cover up the moon with your hand. At some point while approaching the moon, you will notice that it starts appearing outside the realm of your hand, whatever you do. You can use a second hand, and at some point or other, all hands of humanity, a full deck of hands, will not help you to cover up the moon. So it turns out, if you come close enough to the moon, you will have a better access to the nature of the moon. Why? Because now you are confronted with something that you cannot cover up with your hands. But why would the appearance of the moon, if you come closer to it, be less of an appearance than the appearance of the moon seen from here? So why would the moon, when you approach it, be, say, more real or reveal its actual properties? Okay. Why would it be the moon that it is if you come closer? Why is that? If a speck is an appearance, then coming close to the moon is an appearance by parity of reasoning. So what led you to believe that there are appearances, such as specks, in opposition to a reality hidden behind the specks, or a causal origin of the specks, namely the causal origin spreading light out in waves over a certain part of the universe? That very conception, which motivated you into believing that there is such a thing as nature as described by the natural sciences, okay, should lead you into believing that the moon, even if you approach it, remains something like a speck. Let's call it a logical speck, and draw the real distinction here. The real distinction is not the contingent distinction between something far away and something closer, but the distinction between a logical speck and a logical star, which we might just call the idea of logical distance. So what I want to say is that the concept of objectivity that underlies the modern self-description of our technological successes in terms of now we know much better what science is, That very conception of ontological objectivity is informed by a conceptual, purely conceptual or purely logical presupposition. And that logical presupposition tells you something about the relevant proximity or distance that you have to keep to an object in order to know what it really is. And now we get the problem with a further assumption, namely the idea that the closer you zoom in, the more reality as it is in itself you get to perceive. Okay, so the moon isn't even really a unified thing. You know, like from some geological perspective, obviously, you know, it has various layers. It's not really unified anyway. What would it mean to think of it as unified? So you zoom in more closer. You come closer and closer and closer until you reach, you know, the level of subatomic particles, and then you want to come closer again. So you have to do anything in your power to really come closer. Okay? You have to build large tunnels in Switzerland, okay, and shoot shit around in order to come close enough to the moon. You have to get the moon, okay? But while you're approaching the moon, of course, at some point or other, it gets lost. And now you're talking about elementary particles, which uncannily resemble planets, of course. You know, they circle around, and they have nuclei and so forth, even though we haven't seen them, of course. They are unobservable theoretical entities, for all we know, but we think of them, of course, as spheres or point-like, okay? Specks and stars. So it's still, it's still humanity looking up at the stars, using the tool of logical distance and trying to come close, to zoom in. And a lot of our activities are centered around our attempt to come close enough in order to get the thing as it is in itself. So that's, I think that is part of the conception of ontological objectivity that lies behind naturalism. Because now you will start looking for, say, the most fundamental. One American ontologist who's in a certain sense arguing for a kind of naturalism on this logical level, a guy called Ben Kaplan, has introduced, and wants to defend that, introduced the concept of micro-fundamentalism. And micro, I spoke of this last year too, so micro-fundamentalism is the idea that if you zoom in close enough, you will get the real elements, okay? The really basic stuff. Just remember Greek atomism. It's of course updated now, and a little bit, more interesting, kind of. But of course, you get all these Pythagorean models, such as, oscillating strings that are compared to symphonies, etc. So it's kind of this. It's the same set of fantasies driving this enterprise. And behind it, as I said, lies the idea of absolute logical proximity. If you come close enough, knower and known merge into the full-fledged knowledge of the thing in itself. We are just not quite there yet, okay? We will, once physics is unified or whatever you think ought to be done in order to get there. But look, again, by parity of reasoning, everything you will be able to discover by zooming in, zooming in, is as much an appearance as your starting point. So you haven't made any progress on the epistemological level, even though this is what you promised. Okay? Otherwise, there would be no philosophical interest in this activity. But we somehow want to say that the discoveries of modern science are clues to solutions of philosophical riddles. So if you're a real naturalist, you have to say, well, look, you have to lay back and say, this is not at all philosophical. Naturalism just means that I'm interested in certain things. But then that should not be a philosophical position, but just the avowal of your mental state. Like the person who chooses at high school physics rather than German literature, say. Like, oh yeah, I'm one of those. But that wouldn't be naturalism. Then you can't walk around and say, if we want to know how reality is as it is in itself, or if we want to overcome the illusory level of appearances and so forth, then we have to do X, Y, and Z. Okay? Then honestly, you would have to commit to just describing your own, inclinations. Like, like I'm I'm more of the sadomasochistic type. So the naturalism would be something like that, okay? Just an avowal of your sexual or other preferences, and not an insight into how things really are. So what do we do with the specks and stars? So that's the real problem. And I think that this is where Schelling comes in, and so I move to the second part of my presentation. Because Schelling has suggested the following. He says, this is a little bit this sounds somewhat archaeological now, because it's the language of the early 19th century, but I will give you a translation of it. But here, just as a rough approximation to his idea, he would say that nature is on this side of the subject-object split. So nature cannot be the object of investigation. It's on this side of a certain split. Okay. Once the split is there are certain conditions of perception, such as those conditions that interest us as human beings. For instance, human beings somehow think that vision is very important, and they think vision is so important that they should build their picture of the universe on visual metaphors. Velocity of light, that's really important. Okay, but why would you think that, given that there's this weird problem with the visual appearances of things that I've been talking about, and it leads into all sorts of logical and conceptual models, okay, given that this whole problematic thing is there, why privilege, okay, conceptual means that are essentially tied to the parochial features of our visual appearances? Why think that the visual appearances are somehow the clue to how the universe is? Okay, so that would be utterly unmotivated, because what you're doing now is, again, you're just describing how things look to you, okay, given that you are a subject endowed with certain capacities, such as photoreceptors and certain neurons. Okay, to subjects of this kind, it looks as if what's really going on is what is visible. But why would you believe this? Okay, given that visibility seems to be subject to conditions that you want to overcome in the process of theorizing it. Okay, I'm not even speaking about all the problems involved in the fact that theory comes with visual metaphors and so forth. That is all fairly well known, but I'm trying to avoid that. I'm not trying to pull an etymological argument. Okay, so we have to move on this side of a distinction, okay? I don't think that once we accept the distinction, we will get the desired result, namely a better understanding of nature. Once we're within the distinction, we might get a better understanding of what it is for us to know certain facts. Once we're within, call it the subject-object split for the sake of simplicity, once we're within it, we can discover all sorts of things about our conditions of acquiring knowledge. I can find out what it means to find something out about the moon. That's fine, we can travel to the moon under the conditions of the subject-object split and think that this is somehow really impressive. I think it's more impressive than other things, but it's also much less impressive than other things. So it's definitely overrated. And now I just read that the next great plan is, we've been talking about all these fantasies of physiocide and cosmology today and so forth. The next big plan is we will send robots to the Mars with 3D plastic printers, and then they can already build colonies there until we have found a great way of going there, okay? But then, this song by this French songwriter, what's her name again? Mars is no fun. You should just listen to this song. It's like, Mars is no fun. So imagine you get there, and then they've built cities out of plastic, printed by 3D printers. Do you want to live there? I'd rather, I'd prefer that we clean up the air in China, and so that we can travel there more often without losing our breath. I think that's the problem. But anyways. So let's move on this side of the distinction. Schelling's idea is that what we are looking for when we're looking for nature lies exactly on this side of a distinction. And he thinks, let me just mention that would be a different talk, but he thinks that art is essentially about the relation between what goes on this side of a distinction and the way things look within the realm of the distinction. So I do think that the basic outlook of Schelling's philosophy of art has it that artworks show us within the realm of the subject-object split that things have an existence on this side of that dichotomy, which is why artworks are always hard to digest. They're always strange. And that strangeness that arouses wonder, according to Schelling, arouses wonder, in the form uncanniness was a big topic of art for a while. Uncanniness arises precisely because we are confronted with events on this side of a split. So what goes on this side of the split? And I do think that Schelling has a good and a bad idea there. So I'm not a full-fledged Schellingian. It's very hard for me to say no to anything that Schelling has said out of a very long habit, but I'm going to try. So Schelling's idea is that what goes on this side of the split is, and here I agree, and then in a moment I will disagree with something else he says, but what goes on this side of the split potentially utterly differs from what goes on within the split. So things might be so utterly different from how we take them to be that we have to be realists in a very, very broad sense. Okay, one way of checking out whether you're a realist is Hilary Putnam's test. Hilary Putnam has proposed the following test. He says, well, at some stage of the development of his thinking, you're a realist if you believe that even if you have covered the entire ground of the knowable by, like achieving that fantasy of future science, etc., and so you have done anything, okay, that can be done on the basis of your conceptual tools in the absolute future. Okay, at the ideal limit of inquiry, as the saying goes. So at the ideal limit of inquiry, you have done everything, and still you might be wrong. If you believe that, then you're a realist, he says. So if even the best science still might be completely off the track, completely, and I'm a realist in that sense, and I think that Schelling is a realist in that sense, in that he says that, well, the reason why this will always be a relevant contrast to be drawn is that nature is on this side of a distinction. Nature is what we are aiming at uncovering, but we are often doing so under the impression that the wrong contrast is informing nature. So there's a mistake. There are two contrasts that you can mistake for each other. One is the speck and star contrast, and then that is a very problematic contrast, and it certainly should not inform your concept of nature, because then you get, then micro-fundamentalism already looms large in the background. If that's your picture of what objectivity is, okay, then you will try to come closer and build particle accelerators and fuck up the planet, basically. So that's not a good idea. That's exactly this aggressive, we have to break things down, and I was glad to see some Lego pieces in the exhibition, because I think that's also the Lego metaphysics, like I'm made of smaller pieces, so I have to find them, and imagine now I start cutting up my fingers in order to find out who I really am. That would be very odd, but that's what we're currently doing. Like if you saw someone on the street just cutting up his finger and throwing it into particle accelerators, you would be, very surprised and recommend a good analyst to that person. But this is what we are doing currently. We're investing a lot of money into just this activity. Human Brain Project, for instance, is roughly just that on a logical level. But that's the bad contrast. And but the good contrast, says Schelling, is the potential contrast between our overall conception of how things hang together in terms of, say, a scientific theory, and how things might really be. Okay, so that is one way of saying physis cryptis filet, nature loves to hide, or has the habit to hide, which is what filet plus infinitive can also mean. So that is the right contrast. Now, unfortunately, I do think that there's one thing that Schelling has not taken into consideration, namely that he has not described the situation in which we get it wrong. So Schelling makes it look as if nature had an active tendency to withdraw. So the potential divergence between our conception of how things are and how things really are might be overloaded in Schelling by his pessimism. So Schelling, of course, when he came up with that idea of withdrawal, had a pretty bad time in his own life. First, he somehow, this is at least what Hegel always thought would happen, but first he kind of killed a 14-year-old, or whatever her age was, a woman whom he secretly wanted to marry. He's a romantic like Novalis, so there was this pedophilia issue. And but then instead he decided to marry her mother, which was a good choice because she was this amazing woman, Caroline Schlegel. And so he was like, and that was one of the best decisions of his life. Unfortunately, she died very soon after marrying Schelling, and I wonder why. Never go to Schelling as a doctor, by the way. Schelling also was a doctor and used his Naturphilosophie to cure people. And, you see what happened. Also, other things happened. One of Schelling's students, namely Johannes Müller, is largely responsible for the existence of neurobiology. He discovered one of the most important laws of neurobiology in 1826. So, there are some problems there. So, anyway, so Caroline dies and Schelling becomes depressed and says nature is pretty much an expression of a melancholia, he said, and it's all, it's all going down anyway, so it's an ontology of depression. And that ontology of depression led him to overestimating the active withdrawal of nature. Which is why he's associated with romanticism and all the kinds of things that also have been criticized. So I think that this is, but I do think that this is a contingent feature of his thinking, the very fact that, given that he's also kind of the first existentialist, he gave voice to what was really going on in his life, rather than trying to cover it up by concepts. So something like that is going on there too. So again, he discovered the right contrast, I think, and gave interesting insights that we are far away from having understood and conceptualized. I mean, some of the people in the room have done tremendous work towards an understanding of the philosophy of nature in contemporary terms. But there's still a lot of work to do, because just think of the thousands of pages that Schelling has covered with his Naturphilosophie. So the contrast is good, that informs the project. However, Schelling tends to think that there's an unbridgeable gap between nature and our conceptions of it, and that is overly pessimistic in my view, because I do think that, and here's the additional final move, I do think that we need to understand that all the contrasts that I've been referring to, in particular the two contrasts, all those contrasts, okay, they have to be open to theorizing. So what I have been saying has to be truth-apt. I'm not, I haven't been saying things of which I believe, while I'm uttering them and committing to them, that they are potentially false. Okay? So it's part of the trivial practice of asserting things, that while you assert something, you're presenting it as true, in particular to yourself. Okay, so that is one of the many platitudes that are uttered by philosophers, but they're often forgotten. Here's one: to assert is to present as true. So if I tell you, yes, then yes means I believe that something is true. Okay, is the Earth round? Yes, it's false, a potato. But anyways. So, to assert is to present as true, which means that in particular, regarding all the assertions that I've been making about nature and contrast and so forth, I have to ascribe the capacity to know how things really are to that practice. Otherwise, I will create a wrong version of the contrast that I want to install in our conception of nature. So even though there's a potential divergence between our best natural scientific theories and how nature really is, and even though this somewhat increases the likelihood that we don't get things right, or that it's very, that there might be active forces withdrawing from us, whatever dark energy and dark matter might stand for, say, okay, or strings, And whatever that might stand for, but that would be active withdrawal, you know, like, if anything, a paradigmatic version of it. But even if that's the case, that doesn't undermine our capacity for understanding just what I have been asserting. Okay, so we are not that far off the track, okay, so we are not on a Holzweg here. I think that it's always good not to be on one of those. So this is where I'm just simply more optimistic than Schelling for the reasons that I've given. But what I need to and want to emphasize, closing this presentation again, is that the way we describe, or even leading natural scientists describe or self-describe their own activity, not just the metaphors they use, but the overall way of looking at what they are doing and what we are doing and how we relate to how things really are or broadly are, etc., okay? Or our sense for how things broadly hang together, currently, I think, is fairly off the beaten track because we totally overestimate the function of vision for our overall sense of what there is. So it's all modeled as if the universe was primarily there to be seen. Okay, remember what Plato says about Uranos, universe, or the heaven, which is the Greek word. He says it's what can be seen. He thinks that it derives from horan, seen, like theory, he thinks. You know, those are wrong etymologies, both, but Plato started this Heideggerian game of just inventing whatever etymology comes to mind and prove what you try to say by reference to the wisdom of language. Language is really kind of stupid. Okay. That was a side remark, and this would have been a different talk. So, concluding, again, last attempt to conclude. We need to look again at what it would mean for us to overcome the really parochial features in the self-description of modern science and technology. Because, you know, like there is a significant idea behind something like that. So imagine, you know, the Dogen, let's take the Dogen case. So imagine there is something like what the water is for the fish in the Dogen case for us. And I do think there is such a thing, but we have no idea where exactly it lies. But it's obviously somehow tied to our misconception of the paradigmatic function of vision for the universe. We do think that the universe is essentially there to be seen, which is why we have convinced ourselves that the velocity of light is the relevant unity, somehow, you know, like defining what the universe is. We now know how big it is. It's 13.8 billion light years big. And then and this is of course completely anthropocentric, because now it looks like, yeah, if I look in this direction, is that, you know, and then in the other direction, it looks as if you're at the center again. So and then light is shooting through this space, and it's all completely anthropocentric and built on the kind of measures that we have been taking and the theoretical preferences. But given that there's a very problematic conceptual contrast that needs to be replaced by a better one, I think that we have a lot of hard philosophical work to do in order to overcome naturalism, which is really just a form of stupid ideology, and I want to say a particularly stupid form of religion.
Yeah, I will make it short. And I think you are right. Naturalism is a kind of religion. And when you say that naturalism is the idea that nature is the equivalent of what science has said what nature is, then I think you have to see that the sciences are divided too. But if you study biology, you have to go in a lecture over mathematics or physics or chemical. The professor will say to you at first, you are not the right nature scientist. We are the right nature scientist. And in this, yes, it's so. And biology is not, it's human science or animal science, but it's not science and not natural science. And I think you describe it in a great way, this closer and closer and closer. And then you came to a standpoint in which it is impossible to clear the air over China because there is no air over China. And air over China. And no,
there is no atmosphere.
There is
no atmosphere. Is even an illusion.
There is nothing like this. And I hear a lecture from a famous physician, and he said, "Oh, that's all stupid. They have no." But why don't we close our atomic experiments? And so there can't happen anything because there is nothing what the atoms could destroy. I think we end there, and I think you show it in a good way. So. Yeah, and the estimation of the vision, there was, I forgot the name, but there was a social science professor in Kassel who is the creator of the term ocular tyrannis. And I think that is what you mean. Huh? Ulrich Sonnemann, ja genau. Okay, and if you have some questions.
Now we can speak, Markus, because we're appropriately linked up by means of some technology which would otherwise prevent us being able to speak, as just happened. Fascinating as ever and utterly brilliant, but I want to ask a question concerning the active withdrawal of nature, which you presented interestingly. I mean, there are two arguments about that. One is, for example, that nature is precisely that which hides and so forth. But insofar as we've done that, we've already characterized nature as that which loves to hide and so forth. So the entire question about whether nature is X or does Y or what have you is, to a certain extent, moot, or rather, the function of a logical operation. That is to say, X is said of Y. And this is often the way Schelling presents it. So not so much the withdrawal of nature as the additional natural elements that the propositions concerning it are once they're made. So in a sense, as it were, the nature that is premised as withdrawing at the highest point of the philosophical investigations, for example, is so as a function of the logical operation, which is why the unground is highest. But that's just me indulging a passion. God knows we wouldn't want to do that. So. So my question is really, what distinction do you see operative that makes the additional propositional qualification or predication of nature as entailing that nature is precisely, finally, that which withdraws?
The way I do think that this is how I would do it myself. There are, of course, other options of dealing with this. So my own starting point is still predication, so I accept that. And then, but I do start with a certain version of what Frege and Wittgenstein call the context principle, meaning that elements of, what looks like a sentence, elements of a proposition only have meaning within that proposition. So if you think that is a bear means anything regardless of the actual bears that there are. So you think that there is a function in reality, is a bear. So reality consists of bears, unnamed bears that you can only point to with logical fingers, Fühler as Wittgenstein calls it. So you put out your Fühler into reality and then you hang this is a bear onto your Fühler. Okay, so that doesn't work. So which is why Frege and Wittgenstein said, no, the unity with which we have to start is the proposition. But then they had this big problem of saying, what does the entire proposition refer to? And then Frege, with weird arguments, tried to say that all true propositions have the same meaning, namely the true. So Frege thinks that literally, if I say, imagine Peter is a bear, so I say, oh, this is Peter the bear. That sentence, Peter is a bear, has exactly the same meaning, not linguistic meaning, refers to exactly the same thing, okay, as the proposition Kassel is south of Berlin. So Kassel is south of Berlin and Peter is a bear refer to the same thing, the true. Now that's absurd. And I do think that, which is why this problem has to be repaired. This is where I enter the picture, and I think that we can extrapolate from an analysis of truth conditions then we can extrapolate that nature has to fulfill certain criteria of structure in order to be what it is. So we can know something a priori about the outlines of nature. I do think that. But while uncovering nature in those terms, we are fallible. So I do think that Schelling goes from fallibility to there has to be one unified object of fallibility, the unground or nature. And if we use singulars such as this or universe, those singulars are very dangerous because they make it look as if there's something unified, either a unified hyper-object or a unified domain or whatever it is, at least unified. So that is still the remainder of Neoplatonism, of course, in Schelling. So the idea that there should be the one. You need the one, the absolute. Those are all singulars, and I think that it's kind of that we need to replace those singulars within on the level of a theory of predication. But that might still be overly idealistic. Maurizio Ferrari says this is why you're a German idealist, and but for the time being, I'm willing to bite the bullet. But this is how I would try to deal with it.
Just a quick follow-up then. In what context, what repair has been done to the domain of reference such that the distinction between the nature referred to as withdrawing, or the nature predicated as withdrawing, and the act of predication which entails the different logical level at which that occurs and so forth, qualifies as a distinction?
Yeah, so there would be two ways, there are of course again more ways than that, but at least two ways of thinking about what it would mean to me, for me to be wrong about a certain fact obtaining or not. So let's say I believe that Torino is south of Venice. Actually, I really don't know. They're roughly on the same, so I don't know. So let me just assert, Torino is south of Venice. I feel it's wrong, but I really don't know. It's like, had I said the other thing, I would have felt it's wrong, meaning I don't know. I'm in the psychological state of certainly not believing that I know. So I assert this, and now imagine I'm wrong. Okay? Then it's not the case that there are no such things as Torino and Venice, but it's the case that Torino is north of Venice. That relates to the other contrast that I have been drawing between the speck and the star. One way of looking at what it means to say that the speck is only an appearance of the star is to say that you can come so close that all appearances dissolve and then you get the naked thing, okay, the naked reference. The thing, but I want to say that the thing obviously doesn't exist, and you don't, or at least you don't need the thing in order to do that. All you need is that, say, Torino is really south of Venice or really north of Venice, depending on.
Thanks. Thank you very much, Markus. I thought that was a very effective and powerful destruction of the Lego physics of naturalism. I'm very appreciative of that. And again, another little question, maybe so sadly Schellingian, on this issue of the withdrawal. And certainly there are textual passages. I recognize the discussion of melancholy in which one could read it that way, so I don't deny that. But it's interesting to see this problem taken up even 2 years later in Schelling, because the problem with withdrawal really is the problem of the temporality of presence. And it's a temporality of presence that allows the genesis of presence and the creativity of presence to continue to present itself. So really not such a melancholy thing, except maybe, there are the moments in which the inexhaustibility of life is also a sad thing, but also it's a happy thing, and also it's neither this nor that. And a mistake is, after all, not, we'll never know, we're always mistaken. It's stillstehen, it's Hemmung, it's the moment in which we say, only this. But that's also the miracle of temporality, one aspect of which is withdrawal.
Yeah, I haven't said anything about temporality, which is okay. So I'm willing to say that there's some kind of withdrawal, and also that I'm trying to do it sometimes in terms of temporality myself. So I'm personally sympathetic to using moves derived from that philosophical field of research in order to give an account of our fallibility, say. Temporality can serve all sorts of other functions, but like with this particular focus, I do think that it also serves a function. But the kind of withdrawal that I would be willing to accept is, again, not a monolithic kind of withdrawal. So, you know, you can say the withdrawal, and now it looks as if there was one force, as it were. You know, like, you know, like something black, and then you think there's like a shadow. You know, like wherever you turn, it is gone, and then you have unified it. If I think about the withdrawal, that would be, for me, too much of a stable version already of it. So in a certain sense I want more withdrawal than that on some level, and I would say something like this. While we're inhabiting what I call a field of sense, so while we're inhabiting a certain domain that is intelligible to us, we can make certain assertions about what's going on in that domain, but even to the best of our knowledge, we might be wrong about the conditions of the existence of that domain. I take that to be the point of the good old dreaming argument. So I can make all sorts of true assertions about, you know, a car apparently approaching, and two people sitting in the car, and the people being smaller than the car, and so forth. And I might be dreaming the entire scene. You know, which is why Descartes says, of course, that the dreaming argument is not even a real skeptical threat. It's just a description of how things are when I dream. That's why he needs evil demon in order to move one step ahead of just dreaming argument. So I take it that the dreaming argument is just a good description of our overall fallibility. For instance, you know, like, what if everybody here, except you, just came here in order to figure you out? So this is not at all the kind of conference you think it is. No art is here, you know. We all just did it in order to see how you react to the situation. Okay, everything would look roughly the same to you. So you could still make all sorts of true assertions. There are so and so many glasses here, I'm in castle, and so forth, and yet somehow something withdraws. And I do think that withdrawal has infinitely many faces. This is how I would approach it. So less, you know, like with full-blown, high-flown language, you know, withdrawal as différence with an A. To say something I would usually not say, but I do think that it's a legitimate way of paraphrasing the intention. And I'm not clear whether Schelling says this or not. A lot depends on if the unground is closer, has a function of unifying or not. There are different readings of it. I mean, complex. Yeah, that is really